Good day and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Beyond Red Flags, Interpreting Risk in Executive Hiring Decisions, presented in partnership with AESC Global Partner Mintz Group. When evaluating executive talent, some of the most important questions arise after a potential issue has been identified. Today's conversation will explore how to distinguish between explainable concerns, contextual risk, and genuine warning signs, and why interpretation is often just as important as discovery itself. Again, thank you all for being here. And with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Lynn Murphy Rivera, Managing Director of the Americas at AESC, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Amy. I am truly looking forward to this discussion. We have an incredible panel of experts from AESC members, as well as our beautiful sponsor, Mintz Group. We're so fortunate to have their support in developing this webinar. So, without further ado, I'd like the panelists to come on and introduce themselves. Starting with, we can just go to the next slide there. There we are. Let's start with you, Sherry.
Wonderful. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I am Sherry Barch. I am the co-founder and CEO of First Group and New Brick Partners. I am in my 38th year of healthcare executive search and also leadership development in all industries. Our team has been working with Mintz for 5 or 6 years now, I believe. And so we really find them to be a wonderful partner in background checks and helping us serve and partner with our clients better. So great to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sherry. And just going along with the photos there, Laura.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. As Sherry said, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Laura Benstrom. I am a principal at JM Search. We are a retained executive search firm. We've been in business since 1980, working with private equity and growth-oriented clients. I've been in executive recruiting and recruiting leadership for over 30 years. And I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation and be an AESC member. So looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. And Jennifer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Johnson. I'm the CEO of Calibrate. We are an executive and consulting firm, executive search and consulting firm, mainly focused in professional services, organizations, primarily law firms. And Calibrate has been in existence for 15 years, and really excited to be here today. One of the things that in prepping with the group for this panel, I said to the group, which is law firms typically don't do the level of diligence that someone like a Mintz would provide. And that is something that we are working to influence differently going forward. So looking forward to this discussion.
Wonderful. Jen, thank you. And then lastly, Morgan, but not least.
Thank you, Lynn. And a big thank you to you and the AESC for putting this webinar together with us and other experts on this call. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I'm Morgan Taylor. I'm a partner at the Mintz Group. We're a risk advisory and disputes consultancy firm, and I head up our executive diligence practice, work closely with executive search firms and companies directly, really helping to build responsible background checking programs all the way from beginning to end of the search process, helping to make decisions around executive hires and assess the complex risks that come kind of in this territory that's specific.
Wonderful. So this is a topic, by the way, that is really near and dear to my heart. I find it really fascinating how important it is to actually analyze, look, use your judgment, especially when we're talking about these leaders who are at the top of the world and influencing so many sectors, all sectors of everything. So it is so important to have the trust and the experience and all that is required as you're looking at them. And just a little data point before we go forward, there has been, most of you have probably seen a revolving door at the CEO ranks in the past year, where we have seen some changes due to board pressure, some to performance, Some of those are due to the pesky red flags that we're going to be talking about today. And what I'm excited about hearing more from the panel is uh, how many of those could have been prevented, you know? And anyway, let's go to the next slide. And we're going to jump into our questions. And I'm inviting the audience, please, as you hear us talk, you hear them, our esteemed panelists give their viewpoints, and you want a question answered, please put it in the Q&A, and I will take a look at all of them that come through. So question number one, and Morgan, this is for you. How has executive vetting evolved from a compliance exercise into a broader assessment of people risk? This is all about risk today. What's your thought there?
Yeah, and so really over time, we've seen an evolution here in executive vetting. What used to be fairly binary, check the box. Does somebody have a criminal record? Do they have a degree? It's now much more nuanced and expansive. How do we assess someone's values, their judgment, their integrity? And part of what's changing or has already changed is that information itself isn't the only problem anymore. The challenge is in this interpretation, deciding what matters, what doesn't, what deserves deeper scrutiny. And there's this push and pull, right, between interpretation and information. Ultimately, a question can be, what's going to be more dangerous? Missing a serious issue or overreacting to something that was completely explainable? So with this, I kind of think of it in two categories, how important it is to understand the scope of what you're looking for. What does a clean background check even mean in terms of, what you're trying to uncover? And then second, what you should really be thinking about in terms of expanding that scope with this level of search. Different industries, different roles, different geographies, all of these can impact what should be considered, and sometimes even more importantly, what's, even available.
That is a great distinction between looking at one way on paper, another way in actual practice. I would love to hear a story, or at least, let's say, a summary of a story. We're not mentioning names or companies or anything here, but Sherry, can you share with us how the evolution of vetting has played out in candidate vetting for you and your clients specifically, without, of course, keeping everything anonymous, which I know you would. Would love to hear that.
Sure. I think, if you take the data and the analytics from what Mintz is providing, we're really trying to focus on the next steps for driving a larger context for our clients. So we're looking at things like patterns of decision making or default behaviors. So whether that's showing up in their careers, whether that's showing up in their education, maybe they had a 2-part college experience. It's opening it up for additional vetting and really looking for those patterns. And whether that additional vetting is in additional references, additional interviews, maybe even going back to Mintz for additional background checks. So it's one way of many to be able to create the consideration for the candidate with the most complete information. And one story I can provide, excuse me, is there was a candidate that had moved from full-time employment to a 1099 status, but in his interview process and on his resume, that transition really wasn't clear. And upon finding that out through those employment verifications and going back to the candidate, not just thinking, well, he's lying and he's hiding something, he really just looked at it as it was a continuum. He was still getting paid, but it was just through a different vehicle in the organization. It ended up that the client was okay with that, knowing about that ahead of time, and that didn't interfere with his candidacy. However, it did help us understand his decision making and some of his patterns around maybe not as attention to detail and a high adjustment in his ability to say, oh, it's no big deal. So all those things feed into our assessment as recruiters to help our client make the best decision.
Yes, that is such a great story. And I think about that candidate, and I think, he would have done well for himself had he had a better storytelling, let's say, engine or, he was able to kind of weave that in and not make it a detriment. I think we can all take tips on that. So thank you for that story.
But I also think, Lynn, that some
Thank-
things that are obvious to one person aren't obvious to another person. And so that's when, from a candidate perspective, it might make sense to do mock interviews and tell your story, and let other people, not in an formal interview setting, try to poke holes in things. But, I've seen lots of candidates where it just didn't occur to me that that would be a thing, and it turns into a thing. And then people, as Morgan said, overreact.
Yes, that is such a good point, Jen. So getting feedback, from others.
Yeah.
So excellent. On a good path here. Let's jump into the next question. So question number 2. And again, I want to just remind the audience, please feel free to put questions in the chat, in the Q&A. So what role should AI play in executive diligence, and where are its limitations? Laura, what's your thought there?
Yeah, AI. This is the topic of the year or the next 5 years, and probably in the future. But I think AI should absolutely play a role in executive diligence, because I'm sure as many of you are seeing today, it really helps to increase the speed and the efficiency of research about that executive candidate that you're considering. And I think what I've seen in it can help synthesize information, help identify patterns across large volumes of data, map career histories. I mean, really just help to surface areas that you may warrant a deeper dive. But where I think AI, in my opinion, falls a little bit short is understanding the human story behind the data. So similar to what maybe you mentioned a little bit earlier, just around themes or patterns, I think it's really important for us to kind of keep that human element on effectiveness in leadership, assessing how they're making decisions, their credibility, their influence, their fit. I think those insights, you don't get that from just a data set. I think it really comes from conversations with people who have worked with the executive, understanding context, speaking with references, kind of piecing together that. And I don't think that exists in just data sets. So I think AI is not going to explain the why things happened in an executive's career, how they navigated the challenges. I think that's where the human judgment is going to remain critical for us in assessing candidates.
Certainly. And thank you, Laura. With AI, we're going to get more, and sometimes, more is not really needed. It's just, taking a step back. I have a question from the audience that really underscores this. So I'll throw it out to the panel, and would love to have any of you take it on. But at what point does reasonable vetting become paralysis by analysis? Anyone want to take that one?
I bet, Morgan, you get that one quite a bit.
There you go, Lauren. Come on.
Yeah, no, I mean, we do. And you can go scorched earth every time for, kind of every candidate, but at some point you do have to stop. And at some point the public record isn't going to tell you everything. You're going to have to make a decision based on the information that you have. And in terms of AI, at some point there are limitations in what we can find online through technology, and things do need to move into human hands. But a lot of this is nuanced, right? There might be rumors, there might be chatter, lawsuits are settled. There's no clear answer as to whether or not somebody has done something or what their reputation is, because it's gray. So I don't know if this is an answer so much as an agreement, but I think, moving away from just data points into expanding, okay, so Glassdoor, somebody is saying something negative, but what are people actually saying about this person can help, make that decision. And talking to the candidate, like Sherry was talking about, these sort of conversations can help either give you comfort and then can loop back to the background check, right? If they say something, we can then help vet if there's any verifiable truth there and get you as close as possible. We're not going to get to perfect, but I think, we can get to where people are comfortable making a decision.
And I think for any senior hiring professional inside an organization, for us, certainly as executive search consultants, our job is to educate our hiring managers or people, the committees that we're working with on these topics, and that sometimes, we don't want perfection good to get in the way of perfection to get in the way of good, or whatever that saying is. There is a place, and I will talk, I know, in a little bit about how do we frame that up potentially, where we get to a place where this is good. And, humans are not perfect. They're not going to be perfect, nor should we ever have a hiring process that hinges on perfection.
Yes. I have a question that just occurred to me when you said that, Jen, that I'd like to put out there to the panel. When you get a client that is looking for perfect, which I'm assuming you probably get that kind of, I want a purple,
Spotted.
unicorn spotted, yeah, that speaks
Mhm.
25 languages. How do you deal with that when it comes to this kind of in this risk scenario where client just keeps pushing on this candidate that is good, but just keeps pushing you to find the perfect. How do you handle that?
Well, I think it's expectation setting at the outset in terms of the key attributes, what we're looking for, what are the must-haves against the nice-to-haves, and coming to agreement before any search commences. And that would be for an internal hiring professional, recruiter, just like it would be with my colleagues and I and our teams on leading a search. We don't go until we know what we're going for, and at what sort of levels are we okay with, again, must-haves and nice-to-haves. That sort of conversation is not negotiable in advance of launching a project.
Got it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
There's
I would
also,
add, Jen, if you don't mind,
Of
one
course.
of the things that I think you mentioned, this is kind of level setting on the front end. I know it sounds pretty simplified in terms of kind of how you kick off a relationship with a client. But one of the things that we do is we create kind of a top 5 requirement or criteria on the front end of that search, and then every candidate is benchmarked against the top
Yeah.
5. And so it's a pretty easy conversation when you put together kind of a scorecard, if you will, to say, oh, okay, well, they have everything that you've asked for, right? And so you may pivot that along the way, but it does help to kind of keep those expectations in check along the search landscape for the most part, for us anyways.
and I would add that we need to customize the search to the client, because if the client experiences have been rapid turnover in this role, or they're in the middle of a lawsuit with another top level employee. So there's all kinds of things that when we come to the table to partner with a client to reduce their risk in this hiring decision, it may look a little bit different.
Just all of those examples. I'm always amazed at the work that you do, all of you. It is heart-wrenching, and my God, it is so essential. So thank you for the work that you do. It's almost like thank you for your service. So let's go to there's a question here that we didn't assign. But Morgan, I would love to get your take on the compliance landscape and privacy regulations, and do you have clients that are expecting, that automatically
Yeah,
through
I
it?
mean, and
Right.
and this is like Laura said, this is the topic, right? So, AI is powerful. It's a tool. We need to be using it, but it needs to be used with careful consideration. So, in pre-employment specifically, there are regulations that have to be taken into account, not to mention FCRA compliance. So,
Mm,
there really isn't an ability to create fully automated pre-hire AI-driven checks because you need that level of human judgment. You need to reasonably be sure that the information is accurate, the information is complete, it is the correct person. And to have an incomplete human review is going to introduce a lot of risk. Litigation risk from the candidate over, making a decision over the wrong person, or something that was unreportable based on where the job was located, or just or on the reverse, making a hire where it missed some material risk altogether. There's also worries about bias, discrimination. Those are very real concerns. Um, and in some respects, AI and automation can help mitigate some of those risks. So it's kind of, two sides of the coin, mitigating some risks, but then making sure that you're maintaining a level of human involvement that's going to, ensure compliance with all of the regulations that we have.
Yes, Morgan, I was reminded by what you were saying on the risk of a bad CEO hire being something upwards of 27 times the annual salary, and that's financial, and then the reputational risk, nearly that you sometimes cannot recover that reputation lost from a bad CEO hire. So yeah, this is all so important. Now, Jen, this next question is yours. If we could go to the next slide. Question 3, Jen, how do you distinguish between a true red flag and a circumstance that simply requires more content text? We were talking about that earlier. If you can go a little deeper on that, that would be great.
Well, I know that the topic of this conversation is sort of the red flags and diligence and all of that, but I wanted to kind of take it way back to almost the beginning in terms of, a lot of what we do starts with instinct. And not all flags are red. Some are orange and some are yellow and some are green. But I think thinking of a flag as an event is not the right context or use of the thought process. I think it needs to be interpreted as a signal to dive into. So if we go back to the beginning, so much of what this process to ultimately get us to a background or a further diligence review is an interview, right? The beginnings is the interview and it's the instincts. And sometimes that's just a reaction to something that they said or something that doesn't quite line up. And the making a decision off of the instinct, which some people call red flags, is not the best idea. You've got to unpack it. And so the traditional processes of how we've done business in the past in terms of getting to that end, the first step was references, right? But those are curated by the candidate. Those are the majority of them come back extremely positive because they validate the candidate because I put somebody forward that I know will say something nice to me. Now, having said that, 99% of the time, that's what happens. I have seen it, and I'm sure my colleagues have as well, where the reference provided was someone who's like, I don't know why they gave, and that's winds up being helpful actually. But the references are to validate the candidate, not to stress test them. So I wouldn't get too hung up on references. And then background checks in the way that I think we're trying to differentiate today, background versus diligence, is that it confirms facts, right? Like date, rank, serial number type information. You were or you were not employed. You did or you did not graduate, right? But it doesn't tell you anything about how a person operates. And so the real value of diligence at the level we're talking about, where someone like a Mintz would come into play, is introducing independent perspective, people and data points that weren't selected by the candidate that allow the potential employer to explore whatever that potential initial instinct was pointing to. And so once you have that, the question becomes, how do you interpret what you're seeing? So we have three sort of lenses we would look through. The first is, and this is a through line through this entire conversation, is pattern. We're asking whether that initial concern shows up consistently across independent sources in different environments, or whether it was a one-off and it's not a thing, right? So that helps distinguish signals or flags from noise. Second is context, right? So we really want to understand the conditions that surrounded what happened. And when you ask in an independent way the same about the scenario, you hear it often described differently. And so it's those conversations and that diligence at what separates the system from the individual. So there's what do they say? There's your version, my version, and the truth. And so making sure that you have that well-rounded approach is really important. And the third is impact. So focusing less on what the issue was and what that issue actually produced, right? Did it affect performance? Did it affect the company or firm's retention? Did it diminish trust in a team or teams? Would the people that have worked for and with that leader work with them again? So to me, none of those inputs are the answer on their own. They're just signals. And the role of diligence is not to give one certainty, it's to give enough data to point back to those initial spidey senses that maybe you had at the front end to qualify or disqualify all of that. So that's how we kind of look at it here at Calibrate.
Jen, that is so comprehensive, and really everything you said truly underscores the fact that AI does not have spidey senses, at least not at this point,
Yet,
right? I,
yikes.
I have a really good, two good questions here. So from the audience, thank you, audience. This is going to be for you, Sherry. I'm now going to assign these just to make it easier. And if you want to punt it, you can do that. So at the beginning, it was mentioned that firms are now vetting values and integrity. Is that being done by any of your firms outside of the interview piece and
Oh,
during?
100%. Sorry, I know you said Sherry,
Oh,
but
no.
I think you're going to
Oh,
agree.
no.
And Laura will agree, I'm guessing too.
Okay, so yes.
Yes.
And the follow-up is, if so, how? How is that being done? Maybe.
Yeah, I will go back to actions speak louder than words. I think that is a great place to start. So look at those behaviors, look at those patterns, look at how decisions are being made. Um, Create some active scenarios in the interviewing. So looking for what we call that drama triangle. So is that person showing up as a victim, as a hero, as a villain? Are those stories consistent? And then we do have in New Brick Partners, we do have incredible assessment capabilities to be able to provide scenarios that create the opportunity to be able to look at how decisions are being made and whether or not that is aligned with our clients' values and integrity statements. So again, sometimes the art of recruitment is really becoming what I call tofu, right? We are there to make sure that that alignment is solid and that that risk is reduced for this hire. But I think we can all look at integrity in a way that hopefully we're bringing to the table some initial, as Jen said, spidey senses and opportunities to be able to use formal background checks, but also our own capabilities and experiences to help our clients.
Thank you. Thank you, Sherry. And thank you, audience member, for
And
that question.
I just wanted to add to this. I think this is where, a background check can really partner well with what is being done in-house. There can be other signals to integrity issues where is somebody truthful in their resume? Are they leaving off things for a reason? When you ask them questions about things that maybe came up, do they line up with what we found, with what's true? How are they speaking online? Who are they following? I mean, there might be a perfectly good explanation for following somebody like Andrew Tate. Maybe they have teenage sons that they're trying to keep an eye on, but maybe they're a chief people officer candidate, and that might not matter. The truth might not even matter. It might just be the perception of what their team is going to think of those sorts of things. So it's gray, it's complicated, but I think those things can work together.
Yeah, I think too, I mean, one of the things when we, this is where I think, you can't really get away from that human element of evaluation. And so I think assessing someone's values in our process is really, less about asking what they value and kind of more about what you're observing the choices they make when values are intention. And so I think, one of the ways, and I think it's, again, kind of human element, is asking those specific examples. So rather than like, what are your core values? You ask them about describing a situation perhaps where they disagreed with a board member and how did they handle that? Or, so it's those types of experiential questions that I think can really unlock and reveal a lot of patterns and behaviors as well.
Indeed. Thank you for that discussion. And again, thank you, audience. And I have a lot more questions. So let me go with the audience questions, a few, and then we'll switch back to ours, because we're very happy, audience, that you're engaged. So what are the legal exposures to recruiters and employers in considering a candidate's personal history as part of the hiring decision-making process? An example is someone who has been married many, 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 he didn't say that, but many times. I just add the many, many, many there. So someone with multiple marriages, let's say, is that something that one would consider in the recruiting and hiring process? Is that a data point?
I mean, I am not a lawyer, so I have to say that. I haven't been counseled on this topic. I don't personally, and I would leave it to Morgan and her expertise, but I don't think that particular variable means anything to a person's ability to perform a particular role. So I personally, that's my personal non-lawyer legal. I don't know what the exposure would be, honestly, but I'm just sitting here off the top of my head, and maybe my colleagues can riff with me. I can't imagine maybe a scenario where that would matter. If we're talking about, a C-level professional in a large corporation as opposed to maybe some other type of environment.
Yeah, I don't know.
A marriage counselor?
Well, yeah, that is exactly it. I'm thinking about it in the framing of like probably our types of clients, like
Right.
really large corporations and
Agree.
and that kind of thing, as opposed to anything that might be more personal in nature.
Yeah, a bona fide job qualification. I agree. I agree with Jen.
Thank
Right.
you. I was
Thank
worried.
you. Thank you.
No, I concur with the two of you. I mean, I think in life, if it's not job relevant, I think it's hard to bring those personal elements in and bias
Yeah.
how you make choice. So I think that would be a tough one to, again, not legal, not an attorney, but that'd be a tough one, I think, to
Yeah, I
overcome.
don't I don't see the
And again,
relevance.
we as recruiters need to, create a bias-free environment and keep those
Yeah.
bona fide job qualifications in place. We had one candidate that had a DUI and had gone through the classroom work and the restoration for making sure that that DUI was rectified. And in presenting the background, our client had also had a DUI. So there was a level of understanding and what that journey looked like and what needed to happen. And so there was a connection there. So again, just being as complete as possible and relaying that data to the client is important.
So
And
with
maybe
the retelling. Oh, go ahead, please, Morgan.
Sorry, I was just going to add, and how it all relates together can be relevant, or, I think it's all contextual. So I mean, there are obviously things that you can't consider that are illegal, that are, tied to religion or gender or things like that. But there are lots of things that are technically legal, but could get you into other kinds of reputational hot water. Again, as already said, I'm speaking as a non-lawyer, but the gray area of political commentary, that's a really difficult place to navigate. I think, determining what is relevant to the role and what isn't. And I think that's where that conversation with both, your consultants and with either your background check provider is really important to understand. Is there a reason that this matters? We do a lot of education research and placement vetting. There are religious institutions where how somebody speaks about abortion is very relevant.
Yeah.
That's not always relevant. So that's not always something that's going to come up in a background check because it might be controversial, but it's not good, bad, or anything else. But if it is relevant, you want to make sure that that's, being highlighted.
Sure. No, that makes sense. We have one more question, and I have two comments from the audience. So the first, I want to read the comments really quickly because they're very positive. One audience participant said, "I like what you said, Jennifer, about the recalibration and if the behavioral risk pattern is systemic." The other is, and this is more of a comment around AI. For me, the main risk with AI is accelerating the pace of decision making based on the AI analytical data points, but minimizing the impact of decision making. I thought that's quite interesting. So, question, and I'm just going to read it. One question I hear asked of candidates in an interview is, when the announcement is made public that you have been appointed to this leadership role, is there anything of concern that could come up? it can give the candidate the opportunity to table any potential issues. Curious for the panel to give their thoughts on that as a strategy. Would that help bring it out? Yeah.
I mean, it's obviously a little different from where this question is geared, but we do candidate integrity interviews and ask similar questions to that and have found them to be enlightening, but they're also, it can go either way. We've had people disclose things to us that we were not findable for one reason or another. They were not actually named in a file, like in a case, but the underlying lawsuit was very relevant about whistleblower kind of allegations. We've had people share stories of being arrested where, there was no actual criminal case filed. Not everybody knows what's going to be findable from a background check perspective. But we've also had people say, no, nothing to be concerned about. And there are some meaningful red flags in their background check that we can then probe. Well, what about this allegation that you plagiarized this article? Do you think that might come up? And so, ours is a bit later, but I think we've found them very illuminating.
Interesting. Thank you, Morgan. Anyone else add to that? Just your thoughts on this positioning as a strategy.
I think it's a great practice. I mean, the earlier that we can build that relationship with the candidate, understand what he or she is, decisions that they've made, I think that's a great technique.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sherry. We are coming down to, we're heading up, I should say, to the top of the hour, and we have a few more questions. So audience, continue to provide us with questions, but I'm going to go to question 4, and that's for you, Laura. Why or when is pattern recognition often more important than any single finding in your situation?
Yeah, we've kind of touched on it a little bit thematically with some of our prior questions, and I was thinking about this yesterday. We often tell stakeholders that our executive diligence is probably less about finding one critical fact and more about identifying these patterns that repeat over time. Most executive candidates have had complex careers. They've had successes, challenging boards. I mean, just some things, and sometimes things out of their control. So looking at any one event without context, I think, can sometimes lead to the wrong conclusion. And I think what we're really trying to understand is what consistently follows the leader from role to role through assessment and through Mintz's help as well. I mean, have they attracted strong talent? Do they show they can earn trust? How do they react under pressure? I think you're looking for themes. And so I think the strongest findings can come when I think you see several small observations through interviews regarding that leader, and then start to kind of point in the same, kind of help start point in the same direction. So I think that individually those comments might not seem significant, but I think collectively those comments, they can reveal a leadership's pattern that can be more predictive than any one single event.
Definitely. And I as you were speaking, Laura, I have a sort of an observation, and it's a question to the audience, but and also not the audience, but to the panel. One of those patterns could be when a candidate is the type of individual that raises their hand consistently from role to role or even within one role, for the tough assignments. And as you know, I think there's a phrase that the whale that raises his head up, out of the water first is the first to be harpooned. But when that happens, you're in a situation, you're raising your hand for the tough assignments, which means you're at bat a lot. You may not hit it out of the park a large percentage of the time because you're taking on the tough assignments. Do you look at that granular of a level when you're assessing candidates if they tell you the story?
Me or just for the panel?
Anybody, anyone, please. Just would love your thoughts on that.
I mean, for me, I'm thinking about like that example as you're sharing. For me, that can, I guess, go in a couple of different directions. One, you'd want to probe more on the why behind the hand raising, and does that show initiative? Does that show impatience in terms of kind of current state? I mean, I think part of that's contextually, are they in a role for a period of time? But I think it can go different paths depending on kind of the circumstances of when those hand raising. And I like your phrasing. I haven't heard it before around the whale harpooning, but no, I think I'd want to dig and probe more, obviously, and look for those patterns and the recognition around kind of when those instances occurred. What did that reveal, and the why behind it?
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you for that, Laura, for entertaining me there. So let's go to question number 5, right? So how, and this is for you, Morgan, how should organizations, or how do you think they should think about reputational issues, values, and online behavior in today's environment? We touched on a few of those points of, who you might follow and so on. What's your thought there, Morgan?
Yeah, and I mean, this is really that fraught gray area that we deal with all the time. Again, I don't want to keep hammering it home, but establishing that good working relationship is so important. Organizations are really worrying about, both their internal reputation with these hires, how is a hire going to impact their culture? And then also all of the external reputation concerns, how's it going to play in the market? But that internal reputation, that can be so important, building strength, resiliency, and trust with employees, that they're not only hiring someone capable, but someone that can be trusted. And we've helped vetting, right after things have gone wrong. So, there was an organization, they'd gone through several individuals that had been fired for kind of similar issues: sexual misconduct, behaving poorly at company events, drunken behavior. So for them, alcohol was a big concern. So how somebody was behaving online, in some instances, I wouldn't have even paid attention to it. They went to breweries, they went to wineries. It didn't really seem like a big issue, but to them, that was really concerning. Was there a pattern there? A DUI, again, a DUI can matter. How somebody's dealt with a DUI can be the more important piece, but for them, that didn't matter. If somebody had a DUI, that spoke to a potential issue that they'd already dealt with, and the risk was too high for that internal trust that they needed. They were going to have retention issues. People were going to start leaving. So I think that's where that kind of gray area and can really matter, and that online kind of behavior, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes, Morgan. Anyone else? Jen.
One of the things that we really try to do is obviously, as I believe Sherry said earlier, is help drive our clients towards making a decision. And so when we're trying to help drive that, we find that there's so much gray, in Morgan's words, all the time. And so one of the points of advice that I would give to anyone listening would be to come up with their own North Star of what is acceptable and is not acceptable, so that, I mean, we've come into this culture, I think, where, any information anything that's visible is treated as important. And I don't think that is right. Organizations need to come up with their own framework on what matters to them. Again, what's non-negotiable against, well, we'll seek further information, so that they get to a place where they're interpreting the risk according to that framework they've set forward, rather than reacting to every individual thing. So maybe consider, what are the things that would really disqualify somebody no matter what, according to us, right? And it's going to be different for every employer. Okay, well, what are the things that then require context and discussion? And then where will we be willing to take a risk given the role and the environment? What's our risk tolerance? Because without that, again, everything becomes a reaction and emotional. And then you end up with inconsistency from, hire to hire to hire. So I think obviously it's a loose framework based on the type of role and the influence that the position will have in the organization. But there ought to be some sort of framework that is a go, no go. on some of these topics. And
Yeah.
that's what I find is missing from most organizations.
And I just want to add here, I mean, I think that context is so important because it's very easy for something to look concerning that might not be if you peel away the layers. I mean, this can happen with international research. There are some countries where anybody can file a criminal case against anybody they want to. So a criminal case might not mean what we expect it to mean as a US audience. Or there are, the reverse in some European countries, concerns around, preservation of historical sites. It's a really big deal. So something that might look minor to us, a minor citation, the dollar amount seems very low, is actually going to blow up into a political firestorm. Or even here in the US, again, coming back to our AI conversation, there is a limit to what can be found online without human, even just basic human action of going to a courthouse. And you can be lulled into a bit of a false sense of completeness. Colorado, I have a good story here if we have a second, but we were vetting somebody for a financial role, and in Colorado, online dockets are very easily found, and they seem to be pretty complete. This finance candidate had a theft charge. It was recent. You looked at the docket, he had been convicted. It was minor theft of personal property, which again, the statute was not super clear. If you just got that record, it's pretty easy to just move on and say theft, finance, done. However, when we pulled the filing, what this theft charge was, it was theft of somebody's dumpster. Long story short, he had put his trash in somebody else's dumpster and been charged with theft of personal property. Very different story, very different conversation around whether or not you're going to move forward with a candidate.
And that would not have been known without going deeper. It just,
Right.
could have been wiped off the record. Any other comment on that before we move to our last question? All right. And I actually have another question in addition to our last. So this is for you, Sherry. So what is the biggest mistake boards, investors, or hiring committees make when interpreting, kind of like the dumpster case, interpreting diligence findings?
Staying curious. So it's one data point. So that information coming into the hiring decision or even the discernment of the candidates that they want to bring forward into the next round of interviews or even to start. So I think just prepping the candidate for the data. We're going to receive data from all of the candidate background checks. You're also going to receive data as it relates to our referencing and the points that we're evaluating from, and then looking at your future as well. So let's take these all in totality. So that's kind of the second piece. I think there's a mistake where it's not approached holistically.
Yes.
It's very micro-focused. What is that? All of our biases come out, and we don't even want to hear that he was actually just putting garbage in a dumpster. You know what? Nope, I can't. It's too risky. Let's move on. So I think it's the multi-vetting. I think it's staying curious, and I think it's seeking that holistic approach that's gonna help. So if we can, and then I think our behavior and our role in this is to seek to understand. So also to stay curious, seeking to understand and looking for that complete picture. And as recruiters, that's really where we start. Like Jen said, let's start at the beginning. What do we do for a living, right? Mm-hmm. We're trying to get to a relative truth that allows us to be able to de-risk the hire for our client and provide them the best candidate for their future success. And I think that is about that holistic approach.
I would say one of the biggest things we see is when a committee, and in our instance, it's typically lawyers who go into a room, close the door, and talk amongst themselves without any experts in the room that would guide them in the said conversation about said risk or diligence or the assessments, the personality assessments and stuff like that. They go in and they take that information and they don't allow someone in the room to help them moderate the conversation. And it's like the runaway mind train. And then to the audience member with the analysis paralysis, then you never get anywhere. And so I think not allowing the right people with the right expertise and lens into the conversation is a big mistake they make.
Definitely. And would love to hear from all of you on this. So, Laura and then Morgan, it's the question kind of here, biggest mistake and or, risk mitigation and hiring. What is your top advice for both candidate and client? You could pick one or the other, but, would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Sherry said is really spot on, and I think Jen, validated it, is really staying curious. I mean, I think if you think about every CEO or a top level candidate, I mean, they're leaving significant change. They've got a lot of history, and I think the best CEOs are going to have some of that history because they've made really consequential decisions. So I think just don't confuse red flags with trade-offs, because I think there's always some balance, especially when you're dealing with people with years of experience. I think that curiosity, I think, is a great way to put it, but really, thinking through what you're looking at and how you're making choice, and to Jen's point, not get too far into the analysis where you can't really kind of lean in and get to that good conclusion. So that would be my contribution for this in particular.
Thank you, Laura. And we have a comment that really aligns well with what we're saying that just came from the audience, which is, clients can have a tendency to say, why didn't we know this sooner? Without realizing that it is an iterative process for us as consultants, and that you don't know everything about a candidate early in the search. So, is there a little bit of guidance there to the executive search consultant, to the client?
Well,
Like,
I
is
would
there,
say, I mean, if you're getting to the place of engaging someone like a men's group to do the diligence, that's not going to happen until the end of a process.
yeah,
And the stuff that we're talking about is so it's deep, both in terms of digging to find and uncover. And we're not going to waste people's time and doing that with all candidates that we present. We're not going to do that till we get to the end, and maybe not even with only one, maybe two. So I would say we're not, as it relates to the deep research, it's normal to not get there until the end. Um, Sometimes things happen throughout the course of a process where a candidate goes through something in what we call life that just changes how they behave or show up. And that's also human nature, and we can't control that. So those are the top two things that popped into my head.
Jen, those are great. Thanks.
We also have candidates that are also doing their own due diligence. So they're not going to open up their references or allow their backgrounds to be
Right.
checked until they've established interest in the role. And sometimes that does take a meeting with the client or multiple interviews with us before they decide that, yes, they'd like to have a candidacy for this role, because there's confidentiality issues, there could be timing issues. So it's letting the client know that it's a two-way street, and
Mm.
that we will do this diligence, but it has to be at appropriate timing for the candidate as well.
That's
Yeah, we say you're hiring, but you're also buying. Like you're buying and selling at the same exact time,
yeah,
and don't forget that.
exactly. And um, a great comment from the audience in question, which is, and this, I think this is our last one. We could talk forever, guys. This is really, really a great conversation. So anyway, at our firm, we are using a self-assessment tool after initial application that asks a number of questions around resume accuracy. So sort of the standing of their designation. This will help the candidate to self-select out early because they know that we're going to ask to look into all of these things. So are other firms or any of you using a tool like that? That's question number one. Anyone using a tool like that? And then, and I think this is a comment that says, can't really understand, or a tool that sets the stage at the outset to weed out people before they get too far into the process and clients fall in love. I like that part. So anyone using that kind of self-select early out tool with candidates?
Well, I would say as executive search consultants, the nature of the work that we do is a pretty senior level, generally speaking. And so at the executive level, the weeding out wouldn't happen at the front end like that. So my guess is my colleagues on the panel don't have a sort of entry level or a temporary practice or something that's more maybe skilled labor, things like that, that you might need a calling tool for. At the executive level, that isn't something that we're using, and I can't imagine that it would be super well received by a very senior level candidate.
Yeah, I would concur. I mean, obviously we see style assessment, executive style
Yeah.
assessment, things of that nature at the client side, but nothing in that fashion. Yeah.
Well, that's all we have time for. This is an absolute delight to have this time with all of you and to get these great questions from the audience. I thank you all for your time. Laura, Jen, Morgan, Sherry, thank you so much. And we will basically sign off now. And I'm going to turn it over to the next statement that we're going to be making. Just want to make sure. There you go. I'm also going to say this. We invite you to take the AESC and MIDS Group's background screening survey. You'll be seeing that in your follow-up. Please do. It's open not that long, so we want to hear your feedback as soon as we can. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers for a thoughtful discussion, and thank everyone for being here today. Before we close, again, we invite you to take the MIDS Group background screening survey. This year's survey includes a special focus on artificial intelligence and how it is shaping screening practices across the executive search profession, including issues such as false positives, biases and discrimination risk, human verification, compliance oversight, and data privacy. The survey is open to everyone, not only AESC members, and the link has been shared in the chat, and it'll be shared in a follow-up email. Again, thank you for being with us today, and we hope to see you at a future AESC program. Have a wonderful rest of your day.